have a clip? So you're all quiet, so I guess we're ready to start. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Carrie Gerald, coordinator of the Creative Writing Program in the Department of English and Philosophy here at Murray State, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our first event in this year's Murray State Reading Series. Before we begin, let me take care of a few housekeeping items. A friendly reminder to silence your cell phone. If you're a student and you need to sign in for a class, there's a sign-in sheet in the back. We also have books for sale after the reading. Silas, I think, will sign copies, so he'll be at the middle table there to sign copies of your books, so we hope that you'll stick around. Have some refreshments in the back and check out the book table. We also have a department information table in the back if you'd like to know anything about the Department of English and Philosophy and the Creative Writing Program and our reading series. And next week we have another event, Thursday, September the 15th, same time, 7:30, same place here in the Curris Center for Crystal Wilkinson, who is Kentucky's current poet laureate, and she'll be reading from her fiction and poetry here next Thursday evening. I have a few people that I want to thank for their help with tonight's event. Nahanda Busick-Langham from the English Department, Kayla Allen Dunn from the Office of Development, Don Klukin in the University Bookstore, the crew at WKMS, and Jeremy McKeel from Digital Media Services, and my fellow creative writing faculty members. Thank you so much for all of your help. We didn't have a clicker tonight for our PowerPoint, and one of my faculty members, my fellow faculty members, carries a clicker in her bag. I mean, are we prepared, teachers, or what? Pretty awesome. Yeah, it takes a team to do these things. However, we would certainly not be here this evening without the generosity of the 5 children of Clinton and Mary Opelmore, who established this residency in honor of their parents. And I want to tell you a little bit about Clinton and Mary Opelmore and how their lives inspired this residency. So there's a few photographs of them here. Clinton Elstermore was born in 1916 in Pike County, Kentucky, where his family had lived since the early 1800s. Mary Opal Baldwin Moore was born in neighboring Letcher County in 1922. After their marriage in 1941, they ran a grocery business in Shelby Gap, Kentucky, in Pike County, which was very near the Virginia state line. Clinton served in Europe during World War II, and after his return, he and Mary Opal and many others in the region endured a particularly difficult time in the eastern Kentucky coal fields as a result of the post-war slump in demand for coal. One of Mary Opal's sisters had married and moved to Paducah with her husband. This sister became the link to western Kentucky. Clinton and Mary Opal made the difficult decision to leave the mountains and start over in Paducah. Clinton found a job selling cars and eventually owned Moore's Used Cars in Lone Oak. Mary Opal worked as a bookkeeper for Singer Sewing Machines and later as a secretary for Bankers Life Insurance until the early 1960s. Okay, now let me see here. Perfect. Both Clinton and Mary Opal were wonderful storytellers. Clinton's stories were entertaining and humorous, and Mary Opal kept their family stories alive by telling her children and grandchildren about their people in the mountains. Mary Opal also kept journals in spiral notebooks and wrote poetry, and a printing of one of her poems hangs in her hometown's museum in Jenkins, which is in Letcher County. They raised enormous, plentiful gardens each summer and were generous in sharing the fruits and vegetables of their labors. They were always ready to serve a spread for anyone who happened to arrive at mealtime and had a special concern for anyone who grew up having to go without. Their highest priority as parents was making sure their 5 children went to college. Among the 5 of them, the siblings have 11 degrees, including 4 masters and 3 doctorates. Clinton and Mary Opal were also immensely proud of their grandchildren, who they often said were the finest, smartest children they'd ever seen. The Clinton and Mary Opelmore Appalachian Writers Residency was established with gifts from Shirley Moore Menendez, John C. Moore, Tom Moore, Nancy Moore Waldrop, and Jane Moore Waldrop, in honor of their late parents and their family's Eastern Kentucky roots, with the goal of strengthening literary connections between Appalachia and Western Kentucky, while enhancing the creative and professional growth of students pursuing creative writing at Murray State. It commemorates the Moores' east to west journey in hopes of fostering creativity and understanding between 2 distinct regions in Kentucky, connected by the Cumberland River. So at this time, I would like us to give a round of applause to those members of the Moore family who are here with us this evening. Thank you for carrying on your parents' love for literature and education, and for sharing that love through the gift of this residency. Okay. Ooh, wrong direction. The Clinton and Mary Opelmore Appalachian Writers Residency enables us to bring to campus an author whose life and work is deeply connected to Appalachia, and we are thrilled for Silas House to be joining us this evening. Silas House is the nationally best-selling author of 6 novels, 1 book of creative nonfiction, 3 plays, and numerous poems, essays, and features, including work in Time Magazine, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Ecotone, The Advocate, Bitter Southerner, Garden and Gun, The New York Times, and Oxford American. His new novel, Lark Ascending, will be published in 19 days, September the 27th. House was an executive producer and one of the subjects of the documentary Hillbilly, which is now available on Hulu. The film won the Audience Award from the Los Angeles Film Festival and the Media Award from the Foreign Press Association. His novel Southernmost is currently in development as a major motion picture. As a music journalist, House has worked with artists such as Casey Musgraves, Tyler Childers, Chris Christopherson, Lucinda Williams, Jason Isbell, Leanne Womack, and Murray State's own alum, S.G. Goodman, among many others. He's a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers, the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates, and is also the winner of the Dugan's Prize for Outstanding Mid-Career Novelist, the largest award given to an LGBTQ writer in the United States, as well as the Nautilus Award, an E.B. White Award, the Appalachian Book of the Year, the Storylines Press from the New York Public Library, the Lee Smith Award, and many other honors, including an invitation to read at the Library of Congress. Southernmost was longlisted for the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and appeared on several Best of 2018 lists. The book was given the Weatherford Award as well as the Judy Gaines Young Award. In 2021, he was chosen as the Appalachian of the Year in a nationwide poll and was the recipient of the Governor's Award from Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear for his service to the arts here in Kentucky, his home state. He's also known as an activist for environmental causes, LGBTQ issues, and animal welfare. He currently serves on the fiction faculty at the Nausland Mann Graduate School of Creative Writing at Spalding University, and as the National Endowment for the Humanities Chair at Berea College. He's a native of Eastern Kentucky who now makes his home in Lexington and we're so pleased that he's here with us at Murray State this evening. Please help me welcome Silas House.
Hello, thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm really glad to be here. I'm grateful to the Moore and Waldrop families for inviting me here tonight in honor of Clinton and Mary Opelmore. I'm so happy to be associated with this family and especially with the namesakes of this writing residency. They're some of the finest people I know. I'm also thankful to Dr. Carrie Gerald, who has literally worked with me for years to make tonight work because we had to cancel twice, I think, because of the pandemic. So we are finally doing it. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you for about 40 minutes or so about some of the ways I created my new novel, Lark Ascending. Lastly, I'll spend a few minutes taking your questions, so I hope we can be in conversation later. But first, I will get started by talking about what led me to this new book. Nothing changes us more than grief. I learned this in the winter of 2015 when I lost my aunt, Sis, who had been a second mother to me. Sis was foundational in so many ways to me. She fostered a love for cinema. She bought me my first typewriter, my first guitar, my first books. And when she died, I was shattered. I had never lost anyone so close to me, and at one point I found myself in the floor, howling with pain. But life would not allow me to do that for very long. I had long been committed to doing a visiting writer's gig at the University of Ireland at Galway, and her sudden death didn't allow time to reschedule it. The day after her funeral, I had to board a plane bound for Ireland, floating through the airports like a ghost, being steered by my husband, who was thankfully able to go with me. I can barely remember delivering the lectures I had been hired to give there, the dinners with faculty and students. Each day involved the process of waking up and realizing every morning, again and again, that Sis was truly gone, that although she was visiting me nightly in dreams, she had certainly, irreversibly died. I do remember moments of great beauty and wonder during my time in Ireland. The kindness of the people, the melancholy gray of the skies over Galway Bay, the incredible cleanness of the air as I rode a bicycle on Inishmore, a small island off the western coast of the Republic. I remember a sheepdog who followed alongside me on a grassy trail where I was walking and grieving. I bent to pet him, and he licked my fingers while he looked me in the eye. I have survived every trouble in my life by riding through it. There were months when I felt physically sick all the time because of my grief. The only balm I found was writing. So I began to write a novel about a young man who is going through the worst grief imaginable. He has not only lost his home and his country, but also everyone he's ever known and loved. He is utterly alone. My worst fear, as I've always been a person who needs a lot of people around me. And he is undone in sorrow. So that is how my main character, Lark, came into being. I just had to figure out why and how he had lost everyone. I had to build a story around the reason he was trudging along an Irish stream with a dog at his heels as I saw him in my mind. Almost always my novels grow out of figuring out a character's trouble. One thing led to another, and eventually I found myself writing a novel unlike anything I had ever written or imagined before. Lark Ascending is set in the near future, when Lark, a man in his early 20s, is determined to reach the rumored to be safe place of Glendalough in a world that is increasingly hostile. He's escaped the United States, where insurrectionist fundamentalists have taken over, empowered by a climate disaster that has pushed most of the few people who are left into the Northeast. As a gay man, he is not only on the run from forest fires, but also from new laws that make his existence a crime punishable by imprisonment or death. The scenario represents my worst fears of where we are headed if rampant religious nationalism and climate change aren't checked soon. Just as we have personal griefs, we also have global ones, whether they be witnessing climate change or the demise of democracy. This is a dark place that Lark is operating within. Which is why moments of beauty and wonder are so important. I learned that those moments, a visit from the goodness of a dog, the scents of cedars on a cold morning, the restorative power of walking, the fact that sunrise and sunset provide moments of natural art every day, these are the things that carry us through our worst times. In the book, Lark manages to create a new family for himself and to latch onto the goodness that is left in the world. Lark Ascending is a meditation on the darkness and the light. It's a novel that centers on the connection between animals and people, the undeniable power of a country like Ireland, where people have been fighting for their autonomy for centuries, and the beauty of created family. Lark Ascending homes in on the idea that almost always hope survives until the very end, and that if we have a little glimmer of hope, we can at least keep going for a little while longer. I wanted to start by talking about the very seed of this novel so I can talk a little bit more about the way I brought it into being. Along the way, I'll also share some excerpts from the book that will hopefully give some insights into the writing process for both those of you who are budding writers and those of you who are readers. I hope that is all of you. My hope is to not only offer some of the novel, but to also give some insights into the creative process that will interest everyone, but especially readers. There are some instructions that every writer receives in their lifetime. Among the first is the advice to write what you know. Let's see if I can work this thing. There it is. The problem is that most people misinterpret what that means. Most people take this to mean that you can only write about the place you know. I interpret it differently. I've always thought that it's more about what a writer knows at their core. If you have experienced deep grief, for example, then use that. It's something you know intimately. Or it might be physical pain, isolation, longing, doubt, belief, heartbreak. This is more thematic in nature, and it's also something that is evolving for people. In one period of my life, the thing I might have felt I knew the best was the power of blood family. In another stage of my life, the idea of created family was something I understood more deeply. Where you know can be part of this, of course, but the main thing here is write what you know. As I've just told you about why I wrote this particular novel at this particular moment in my life, because what I knew best then was grief, deep grief. You might have noticed that most of what I mention as having deep knowledge of are troubling, dark aspects. Grief, depression, longing, heartbreak, isolation. Of course, I've known great joy in my life too, in a deep way. But what matters most in a piece of writing is trouble. Trouble equals conflict. And this is one of the absolute cornerstones of creative writing. If you're a writer or a reader, it might interest you to know that every piece of literature can be broken down into this little notion here. I'm only going to teach for a minute. This is the CCCR method or structure, and that is conflict, complications, crisis, and resolution. We can also think of these as beginning, middle, and end. But as a writing teacher, I talk about it as CCCR. Of course, beginning is your conflict or trouble. Middle is the crisis and the series of complications that leads to that crisis. And then the end is your resolution, which sometimes isn't a resolution. I know that's confusing. But you can also divide that up into acts. For me, separating it into acts helps me to look at a piece of writing and see if I'm getting it right or not. It makes it more manageable for me. It gives me a structure and allows me to focus on sections instead of the whole. And when you're working on a 300-page novel, you need to work in sections and not the whole. To help make sense of this, I'm going to show you very briefly what I show to my writing students. And this is one of the most famous stories ever broken down into the CCCR method or structure. This is Cinderella. So the conflict is between the stepmother and Cinderella. And then we have this series of complications. Cinderella is invited to the ball. Stepmother says you can't go. Then there's a fairy godmother. Then the fairy godmother says, but you must be home by midnight. The prince falls in love with Cinderella. The clock strikes 12. Everyone must try the slipper that she has left behind. And the stepmother says that she may not put her foot into the slipper. She does it anyway. And this ends up with the slipper fits. That leads to a wedding. Because this is a fairy tale, everything ends beautifully. And they live happily ever after. And so we have that resolution, and that's the resolution we often want that real life usually never gives us. So that's a crash course in the CCCR method. The most important part of this is the trouble, the conflict. This is basically where we present to the reader what is at stake. What does the character want? What is the trouble? For me, the most fun part is figuring that out. Building the character through their trouble, which is often connected to what they want or don't have. Nobody wants to read about happy people for 300 pages. We want to read about people who are in trouble. You know, we don't like happy people, really. We like people who are in trouble. We root for people who are in trouble. And the goal is my goal is to get them right to the edge of happiness, and that's the end of the book. I don't want to show them in complete happiness, but I want to get them near that. I want them to have some kind of resolution. Most of all, I want the reader to have a resolution. So sometimes your characters don't get the resolution, but your reader does. So all I knew going into Lark Ascending was that main theme, grief. So I had to figure out the plot around that, which would give me my 3 acts, which are absolutely needed for a story to be told. Every writer has their own way of doing that, but for me, it is almost always via the character. With this book, I began to see my trouble or plot first, that a family was on the run to escape disaster. I knew that my main character was a young man in most of the action of the book, but that he is telling the story as a 100-year-old man who has survived and is looking back. I had noticed that there is a lack of adventure stories in our modern literature for adults. So I wanted to write an adventure story in the vein of Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson, or The Call of the Wild, White Fang by Jack London. These are 2 of the main inspirations for the book structurally and as an adventure story that is told as a piece of literary fiction. But I also was thinking a lot about The Handmaid's Tale, of course, because this is the best piece of speculative fiction that I know, and I have never written speculative fiction. And also it's dealing with the dangers of fundamentalism, which I'm looking at too. And so I especially wanted to look at The Handmaid's Tale to make sure that I didn't do anything that she was doing in The Handmaid's Tale. So I wasn't looking at it to copy from it, but to avoid it, if that makes sense. So I'll briefly introduce you to my two main characters. First is Lark. Like I said, he's a 20-year-old gay man who's been hiding out in the mountains of Maine with his family after a series of forest fires enables an insurrectionist group to take over the government. And the best way to do that is to launch us right into the story. The book is not told chronologically, so when we first meet him, he and his family are on a crowded refugee boat crossing the wild and dangerous North Atlantic from Nova Scotia to Ireland. What I recall best is the noise, the thrashing of heavy sprays, the thundering of the sails, the shrill cries of the crew, the suffering of the seasick. I was ill the entire first week of the crossing. Most everyone was. All of us hanging off the sides of the boat, moaning and retching. I've never known such misery, despite what I've been through since. I have had many adventures in my life, but there is no matching that anguished time. There's pain and suffering, and then there is misery, which is what we lived while we crossed the ocean. And of course, none of us was as bad off as my father, although I wouldn't realize that for many days into the voyage. The Covenant had once been a grand yacht meant to carry about 10 wealthy passengers. The boat was most likely stolen from some unwatched dock in the wake of the war. Now it was scraped and worn, but still sturdy, with 2 large sails latched to thick masts. That first week, my father did little more than care for me, although he was in far worse shape than I was. And besides, I was 20 years old, and I had seen most of the people I cherished die in front of me. So I was grown in every way a person can be. But there I was, accordioned across my father's arms, helpless, as our boat rose and fell across the dark blue sea. There was not much he could do anyway, nothing more than lie there beside me. I didn't realize it at the time, but the injuries to his legs were already working on his mind as well. This truth would present itself soon enough. Sometimes I heard the others on the boat making fun of me. Someone that useless ought to be thrown overboard. But I wasn't just seasick. I was undone in sorrow. Only days before, we had been a family of 6, and now we were only 3. Every time I retched over the side of the boat, I felt like I was vomiting up some of that grief. But nothing can get that out of you, no matter how hard you try. Everyone else on that boat was going through the same thing in one way or another. Grief had ravaged us all. We were the survivors, and we had all lived through nightmare days. I thought I was at my lowest place, but I didn't know that things would soon get worse. By the end of that first week, I stood and got back to work. We had lived through most of our country burning and what followed. Food shortages, war, migration. We had lived just fine on our own for 7 years up in the mountains, hiding, surviving 7 brutal winters in those woods. We had buried people we loved with our own hands. We had walked 12 hours a day for a month to get to Nova Scotia so we could get on this boat. We were survivors, and we were going to make it across this ocean. Now, I've never been on a crowded refugee boat in the middle of a wild ocean, of course. I've really not been in the middle of the ocean, period. So I had to use my imagination to write all of that. I knew the grief, but I didn't know the grief he was experiencing that. I didn't know the world he was experiencing that in. I had to latch on to a particular sensory emotion, and I decided that sound would be the best one to use a lot to capture the sea. But to put myself on a refugee boat in the middle of the ocean, I felt that the best way for me would be to really look at visual representations. So I looked at a lot of photographs. I read a lot about the nature of refugee boats, what boats are used, the sizes of them, the capabilities. But I also spent a lot of time just studying these pictures. And, spending a long time putting my eyes right to the pictures and really looking closely at one person at a time and seeing the different things they were going through, whether that be terror or sickness or a sense of complacency or whatever. I had to capture all that in this whole opening of the book. I also wanted to capture the feeling of the ocean in these pages, and one way I did that was by looking at paintings, a lot of paintings. The light's kind of bright in here, so you can't see it very well, but I especially consulted paintings that were full of violence and beauty of the ocean. So for a passage like this, I might be looking at a painting like this. This one's more abstract. Sometimes there was a calm spell when we drifted along and I could close my eyes, imagining myself back home on the mountain, the only place I'd ever been safe. In those interludes, there was nothing but the sound of the water slapping against the boat. Everyone was either asleep or silent in their misery, and there would be a peace for a time. I'd open my eyes and look out at the aching blue of the ocean, a color I had never seen in nature, and that most likely only exists in the middle of the Atlantic. A blue like a storm cloud full of unspent lightning and unfallen rain. There was some comfort in knowing that although the world was being torn in two, there were still remarkable things that went on being, that refused to lose their shine. Some days, it was only the wonder that kept us going. I mean, I can't look at a painting like that and not see the violence and the wonder and the beauty. And it really helps me to study these and then write about them. So this is a dark book. As I've told you, it grows out of deep grief, and my lead character has lost everything by a dozen pages into the book. He's lost everyone. I am dealing with dark themes: climate crisis, the demise of democracy, the loss of one's country, loss of family. So I had to figure out how to not allow the novel to get swallowed up in that darkness. I had to figure out how to let the light in. So one thing I did was what I've given you examples of here, showing you how even among our saddest, lowest times, we can latch on to those moments of beauty and wonder, and that they can carry us through. But I really wanted to put that more into action, and I decided that the best way to add more hope and light to the book was by making one of the main characters a dog. This is our beagle. His name is Ari Prince Rogers Nelson. He's named for a character from the Royal Tenenbaums and also Prince Rogers Nelson, one of the greatest musicians ever to live. He mostly gets called Buddy. I've lost my place, sorry. He's very spoiled, and you may remember in my opening that I mentioned when I was in Ireland, I was for a period followed by a sheepdog as I was walking along. For a while, the dog in Lark Ascending was based on that sheepdog. That's where the idea came from. I did all kinds of research on sheepdogs. I read everything about them. One of my best friends has 2 sheepdogs, and I just grilled her constantly about them. I went and spent time with the sheepdogs as much as I could. Around the same time, our daughter gave us this beagle. And the more I got to know him, the more I knew he was an even better candidate for the dog character in the novel. Beagles are very affable, they're playful, they're joyful, they're gentle, and they are great walkers. It made sense to use the kind of dog that I had at my disposal to study even more intimately, and as soon as I started writing the character as a beagle, it all made sense. I was nervous about this, though, because in my mind, I so strongly associated sheepdogs with Ireland. It's what you always see. So I asked an Irish friend of mine how common beagles were, and she told me that she had grown up around more beagles than sheepdogs. So I finally had my permission So hopefully readers will leave the book thinking of the dog as being a vivid character, as vivid a character as the humans in the story. In the novel, we're going to get dark here again, dogs have been outlawed. All pets have. The situation is so dire, many pet owners have put down their dogs, thinking this is the humane thing to do. And this is based in fact. In 1939, when England was preparing for war with Germany, English people put down 750,000 cats and dogs in 1 month to protect them from starvation. As you can imagine, when I read that tidbit of history, I was just devastated to think about it. I tried to imagine a world without dogs and cats. It made me study on how terrible things can get during times of turmoil, the sacrifices we might have to make. I thought that was such an incredible and awful thing that I had to write about it in some way. And thematically, it made perfect sense for the novel. A novel in which people are doing whatever they have to survive. So with all of that said, I'm going to read you a scene that introduces the dog in my book. His name is Seamus. These are some handbooks that were used during the Blitz about putting down the dogs in a humane way. Seamus is named for the great Irish poet Seamus Heaney. So here's just a little bit about him. Tiny green leaves of a huge rhododendron. I squinted and saw that the white something had spots of black and brown too. I kept looking until finally I could make out a paw, and then 2 brown eyes looking right at me. A dog, a beagle. I hadn't seen a dog in years, since I was very little. They had been outlawed when I was a child, too hard to feed during the hard times. Everyone had been forced to give them up, to take them away. I didn't want to think about what had happened to them. As a child, my parents had kept them alive from me by way of a book they had found when we made our way up the mountain. The dog encyclopedia had photographs of several different breeds, and beagles had always been my favorite. I liked their speckled legs and large brown eyes and the description of their disposition so much that I had memorized it. Intelligent, determined, merry, gentle. I had started to believe that dogs didn't even exist anymore, but there was one looking right at me. Strangest of all, the beagle was hiding, not barking, smart enough to hide. Later, I would think how stupid I had been to not be afraid. I had overheard tales during the hard times of wild dogs roaming the countryside in packs, so hungry they tore into people. I should have climbed a tree or run as fast as I could, but I was so glad to see a set of eyes like that, almost human, that I dropped to one knee. "Here, boy," I said, the first words I had said in 2 whole days. "Come on, little buddy." The dog rested his chin atop its 2 front paws and was flattened down as low as he could make himself. His eyes looked eager, although he inched himself back at the same time, afraid. But I felt like he was reconsidering his fear. "I won't hurt you, buddy," I said, although I could hear in my own voice that I didn't sound very convincing. I sounded defeated, tired. The dog wasn't budging. He was hiding. He let loose a couple of very quiet whines and backed up so that the rhododendron covered his face but left his front paws exposed. Thunder, definitely thunder, close enough that I could easily tell it from bombing. I looked up and saw that the leaves of the trees were turning their back sides to the sky, stirring in the kind of wind that only comes before a rainstorm. And then roiling green-gray clouds moved into the center of the sky. The next growl of thunder shook the ground. I had to get moving, find some cover, and I wasn't about to trust the dog enough to try to drag him out of his hiding place. So I moved on through the woods, wishing for his company, hating to leave him behind. The first drops of rain fell as I made my way back down to the creek. I hadn't moved far when I felt him behind me. I turned and he lowered his head, one leg crooked up. His eyes were set against mine with such intention that I felt he could read my mind. Ahead, I spotted a group of rocks that together formed a little hut. I ran to it, ducking into the small opening and sitting on the dirt. I put my hand through the opening and lowered my face so I could see him clearly again. He was still watching. "Come on, little man," I said, and then he came forward. I waited. I was so tired I could barely move, but somehow I thought if he might come near and put his wet nose into the palm of my hand, I would be re-energized. This one act would be enough to get me through. And so, this was the first time that he saved me. The dog had come forward, but now he hesitated, took a step back, his brown eyes locked onto my face. "It's okay," I said, and I realized that even my lips were tired, even the muscles in my face. I felt slack-jawed. The rain was falling quiet and soft. I knew that any minute the sky would open up. The sound of thunder was shifting closer and louder. "Please," I said to the dog. I did not want to be alone. And so he did, close enough for me to pet him. There were small twigs and cockleburrs caught in his fur, but his coat was somehow clean and smooth. I leaned close and he startled me with a lick to the nose. I could see he was wearing a red collar, mostly hidden by his thick fur. I took hold of it, and there was a small round silver medallion hanging from it that read Seamus, Sherkin Road. I whispered the dog's name, only knowing how to pronounce it because my father had loved Seamus Haney so much. I caught sight of him back on the mountain in Maine, standing before the flames of our fire, one hand floating out in front of him like a bird, the other a hold of his belt buckle as he called out, "Death would be like a night spent in the wood." At the end of the poem, he put his hands together and looked briefly skyward to give credit. "Seamus Haney, ladies and gentlemen," he'd say, then bow as we clapped. I took the dog's ears in each hand and felt them in my palms, smoothed down his neck, along his back. He was looking at me as if he had been craving such a massage. Seamus's eyes had sorrow in them. This old boy knew what deep loss was, just as I did. Two creatures can always tell that about one another. The last thing I'll tell you about the way I built this novel is about the music. I always use a lot of music within the body of my novels. I usually make a playlist of about 75 songs for each character. I have particular songs that I play to help get me into the characters. Sometimes I use particular songs that help me set the mood or the tone. For this book, that was particularly important. This novel is an adventure story and an epic story that takes readers on a journey from the mountains of Appalachia to Maine to Nova Scotia, across the Atlantic, on a long walk across Ireland. There's Ari again. So I needed to replicate that journey through music as well. The title of this book comes from one of the most beloved pieces of music in history. The song is a 14-minute, one-movement classical piece written by Ralph Vaughan Williams, one of the best-known composers of modern times. The piece of music itself tells a journey, and I was going to play you a 1-minute snippet of it, but I don't think I can figure out how to do that on this clicker. It's not going to work anyway. So I'll just tell you about some others. First I will tell you, Lark Ascending, the song, we experience every emotion from desperation to joy. And I wanted to take you on a real journey emotionally and physically in the book, and the song captures that. If you do one thing tonight, I hope you will go home and go to YouTube and listen to the Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams. I cannot listen to the song without being deeply moved. So I hope you'll listen to it. I have other kinds of music throughout the book. In the book's opening, the reader knows they're on a crowded boat crossing the Atlantic, but you think that you're maybe in the 1800s until someone starts singing U2's With or Without You. And then they make a reference to how this is a really old song. And so you realize that you're in the near future. You're about 20 years from now, in a time when YouTube's not around anymore. Not that I'm wishing YouTube gone within 20 years, but I'm going to skip over some stuff because I've over-prepared, which is always better than to under-prepare. Lark's theme song throughout the book is the one I love, by REM. It's one of my favorite songs ever. To me, it is a foundational love song. And this is a recurring thing for him of remembering the people he loves. And he sings it to himself a lot. Oh, shoot. Another really important song in the book is I Love My Dog by Cat Stevens. Listen to that one, too. God, it's such a great song, especially if you're a dog lover. And the really great thing about it, it not only conjures what it's like to love a dog, but the tempo of the song is matching a dog trotting. And so every time I was riding Seamus walking, I was listening to that song to capture that rhythm, hopefully in the sentences. Another character in the book is Helen. She's a mysterious Irish woman. And so, of course, I used Irish music a lot to get me into her character. I also thought a lot about, this is 20 years past electricity that these people are living in, and I thought, what songs from right now would people still be singing that they wouldn't need recorded music of? And I knew people would still be singing John Prine songs, because any good musical gathering I've been to, somebody pulls out a guitar and sings Angel from Montgomery, or one of his songs. So there's a lot of John Prine. There's some Brandi Carlile. I think people will be singing her. There is a playlist on Spotify and YouTube. So go and look for this playlist and follow it so you can, whenever I add new songs to it, they'll come to you. Let's see. I have one more scene here, and then I'm going to turn it over to y'all. This is pretty short. This is just a little scene of them walking, and as they're walking in the rain, they're talking about some music. When the rain had died down enough that we could hear each other, Helen spoke. When I was growing up, storms like this didn't happen in Ireland, she said. I had heard my own mother say the same about back home. Every time the big winds and the hard rains came, I couldn't imagine a world without such storms. Just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Then, walking. Sometimes Helen sang some of her walking songs very quietly, and usually only a few lines from each one, as if she could not remember an entire composition. A Storr McCree, Wild Mountain Time, Country Life. Don't you have some songs, boyo? She asked after one of her songs. I didn't know any of them all the way through, but I knew verses and choruses of all the songs we used to sing. Angel from Montgomery, No Hard Feelings, You Got Gold, The Story. Helen laughed and clapped when I had finished. That's gas. I had not heard those songs in donkey's years. For long stretches, there was only the sound of our footsteps. We neared Seamus, where he was enjoying a fine time of rolling on the wet ground, probably in something nasty, the remnants of a dead animal or perhaps a scattering of fox manure. As soon as I came close, he bolted to his feet and went back to jogging alongside me. He'd not be sleeping anywhere near me tonight. Suddenly, the rain increased again, large drops that fell in misty sheets like swaying curtains in front of us, drumming the leaves and the ground. We fell into silence, and as always, my mind wandered to the past, my parents, the sweet-smelling woods of Maine, the bruised blue of the Atlantic, Arlo, a kiss against his knuckles, his cedar scent, all those ghosts always right at my heels. When my parents had told me to always keep going, they had not only meant with my legs, but with my mind as well. Thank you. think we have about 10 minutes. If y'all have questions, I'm glad to talk about anything. Yes? That I've written. Oh, that's like choosing your favorite child, sort of. It's usually the last one that I wrote, because it's the one that I'm the most anxious to talk about and that I'm most excited about. But also, I like them for different reasons, sort of like your children too, I guess. But, they're all different in their own way, and even though you love them equally. I'm really thankful for Clay's Quilt. In my first book, it gave me a career, and I was not expecting to have a career as a writer. I thought, I really want to write this book because I want to read it. And I thought maybe some people in Eastern Kentucky would read the book. Nobody was more surprised than me when it became read nationally and then internationally, and then I had a career as a writer. So I'll always be thankful for that, but you also always want to rewrite your first book as well. Yeah. What else?
We have spent so much time working on a project. How do you keep yourself from falling out of love?
That's a really good question. I do it by the sort of the things I'm telling you about. I keep myself invested by creating a soundtrack and doing the research. And it keeps me excited when I'm thinking of new ways to get more immersed in the work. That's always revitalizing, So I suggest always going beyond just the project itself and really making the world around the project as rich as you possibly can, in any way that you can. I mean, I'm feeding that piece of art in every way that I can, and I'm overwhelmed by it. It takes over my life. One of the first things I tell my creative writing students is I care more about the novel that I'm writing right now than I care about teaching you all. And I tell them that because I want them to feel that way about what they're working on. And I also say, this has to be the class that comes before all other classes. Everything else is secondary to this class, because if you're an artist, you have to care about the art more than anything else. I think you just have to sustain yourself every way you can, and it's really hard to do that because we live in a culture that teaches us that artistry is selfish, and it's not. True artistry is giving back by putting some kind of beauty into the world, And so I'm very opposed to these people who think of art as sort of, something fun or a hobby or something you do if you just have enough time to do it. No novelist I know has the time to write that novel. You make the time because it's really important to you, Yes.
Have you ever experienced writer's block? And if you do, those techniques that you use help you?
The question is, have I ever experienced writer's block, and if these techniques help me not to? I have never experienced what I would call writer's block. I have experienced where I just can't work on that anymore. And the reason that I think it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think too much about it, you'll freak yourself out to the point where you can't write, Excuse me. Really, the way I fight that is I always have several projects going at once. And so if this one, I always think of it as a stovetop. And I think of like 4 stove eyes, And on this one, there's a pot that's just boiling over. And on this one, it's just starting to simmer. This one's done, but I still have it on the warmer, and so each one needs tended in a different way.
Is that like working on parts of the book?
Yeah. So when this one sort of peters out, I go to this one, and eventually I'll make my way back to that one. Every once in a while I don't, and that project just falls through. And Maybe I will someday, I don't know. But I try not to. I usually feel like if I get 50 pages into a book, that I'm probably going to write it. You know, I'm probably going to finish it. I have the same philosophy about reading a book too. I would finish a book no matter what. I would be determined to finish it, no matter how miserable I was reading it. After I turned 40, I'm like, life is too short. After 50 pages, if I don't love it, I'm done. Unless sometimes I hate read a book too. You know, you want to read it just to see what all the fuss is about, even though you hate it. Yes.
Who do you read? Who are you looking forward to reading their next book?
The contemporary writer whose book I'm always, really excited about it if a new book's coming out is Marilyn Robinson. She's a foundational writer for me. And also, honestly, Anne Cleves, she writes mysteries, and mysteries are my comfort food. I mean, they're beautifully written books that are also just, they're real page turners that I just love reading. So I read a lot of mysteries. I'm always looking forward to the new Anne Cleves. She created Vera and Shetland, if you know those TV shows. Louise Erdrich, I'm always looking for her new book. There are so many that I could name off, but my mind's blank. Those are the first ones that come to my mind. Yes.
I've been told that you're involved in the anti-bullying crusade. Can you elaborate?
It's more just about speaking out on those issues and writing op-eds, on those issues. And I speak at, sometimes like a university might have a gay-straight alliance or something like that. They'll ask me to come speak. So it's sort of that kind of activism.
Would that said activism include like special needs children as well?
Sure. And also, the main part of it really is legislative work. Sometimes speaking in front of the legislators to ask them to pass particular bills, or working behind the scenes with politicians on things like that. It's that sort of thing. I think it's really important work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Eli the Good is one of my favorite novels, even though it's written for a young adult audience, is how it's marketed. But when you start writing a piece, do you have an audience in mind? Do you know it's going to be an adult novel or young adult? Or is that a decision that you come to later, maybe with your editor and your publisher and those kinds of things?
I did not write Eli the Good as a young adult book. When I sent it to my editor, she said, this book is too gentle. It's a young adult book. And I said, well, he's a gentle character. That's who he is. That's who these people are, Not everybody's the Sopranos, And so, and also, some young adult books I've read are pretty rough. So gentleness is not something I necessarily identify. So it's a mystery to me I guess the main thing is theme, is how they decide on that more than anything. Some of it's also vocabulary, I guess. The only book I've ever written with an audience in mind, I wrote a middle grade novel. It's called The Same Sun Here, and it's for 5th grade and up. And that was mostly about vocabulary, was what we were thinking about. And that book was I really felt out of my element. I don't really know how to write for children. I really don't. I love children one-on-one, but if all of you were children, I would be so nervous right now. So I'm not a very good middle grade author because they send you to schools, and I'm kind of terrified. I don't know how to entertain 500 children. So anyway, I don't really think about an audience at all. I always write the book I want to read. That's the main thing that I do. And every writer that I admire, most every writer I admire, I've heard them say that. I said, yes.
Do you plan an audiobook soon for Lark Ascending?
Yeah, it's already done.
Oh, it's
But I didn't do it. An actor had to do it because it has a lot of Irish accents, and I wasn't going to attempt that. It would be a disaster. Yes.
Yeah. What did this book do to your grief?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, you know, grief never goes away. It just changes shape, right? And so I think the book really helped it to change shape, and it made it feel productive. When I am in trouble, when I'm sad, I need to get busy. And some people's way of dealing with grief is to just sort of sit down, you know, or to lay down. I can't do that because then it just goes deeper for me. I have to just do something. And so it gave me something to pour that grief into, and now I can look at it and think, you know, this is a result of a lot of pain. And I do feel like that it articulates that abstract notion, I think. It gets at the deep elements of grief. So I'm proud of it in that way. Yeah. I don't want to keep y'all too long, but I'm also glad to answer questions as long as you want. So a couple more? Yeah.
I'm curious about, can you talk about your process, like how you keep everything organized when you're actually having ideas? You talked about the different parts.
I'm very, very organized about my writing, and I'm absolutely disorganized about everything else. I never know where my keys, my wallet, my phone. I lose my phone 10 times a day. Every morning is this mad search of me cursing really loudly trying to find my wallet or my keys, you know. And I've just sort of accepted that's what I have to do because I devote so much to the writing, being organized on that. So when I'm working on a manuscript, there's a lot of Post-its everywhere, you know, and I use a big cork board, and I have lots of things on the cork board, and it's all organized, and all of my characters, I not only have particular music for them, but like I also have like a color scheme in mind for the book and for each character. And that's just something that works for me. I think every writer just has to find something that works for them. One of the first things I have to figure out to create a character is what their song is, though. You know, so I always do that. I can't really create a character until I get their name right. Eli the Good, for instance, it took me forever to name that little boy. For a long time he was Matt, and that just didn't work. It didn't work for him. And I knew it had to be a little name because he's real little, you know. And so Eli was just kind of perfect because this is how deep in the weeds I get with this stuff. Because it's almost like somebody leaning against a tree, the way the name looks. You know, and the way it sounds, especially, I thought a lot about, as a child, how often our mothers would be hollering for us at dusk, and I liked the way it sounded, Eli, you know. So things like that come into play, you know. I've rambled totally off that question, but you see what I mean. I have to have my own sort of weird organization that doesn't seem organized at all to anybody else. Yes.
So sort of working off of that, and you may have touched on this earlier, but when you're coming out with a character, and I know like you take from your own experiences in life and such, but would you say that generally you find the feelings and traits before like making a person?
Yes. That's the other thing. The song, the name, the defining trait. And so with a character like Lark, for instance, I knew that he was a survivor. That's his defining trait. And so everything about him goes back to the fact that he's going to survive. And sometimes he does stuff that, you know, he feels bad about to survive, and et cetera, et cetera. So his whole motivation grows out of survival. So, you know, for instance, if you know a character is really stingy, you know something really fundamental about them, and you can just radiate other traits out from that definitive trait, you know, and then you have your character. I'm glad you asked that, because that's a really important writing exercise I have my writing students do, where they have to come up with one trait and then that one trait leads to other traits, until they create a character. Yes?
You were mentioning with the writing process with Lark Ascending, trying to find moments of light, basing the book in a lot of dark themes of climate crisis, democracy, that arguably are very, very much real today. And I was wondering, for yourself, personally, where do you find your own sense or moments of light or hope? For yourself, right?
The natural world, first and foremost. The most important thing to me as a writer is walking. I walk 4 or 5 miles every day, and a lot of times that's just around my yard, like in a big, I go around the yard over and over again, almost like a monk would. And a lot of times when I'm walking, I'm reading, or sometimes I'm writing, and the beagles follow me every step, around the yard. And the natural world, music, other forms of art. I'm a big believer in ekphrases, meaning other forms of art inform the art that you're creating. So when I'm reading, or when I'm really active writing a novel, I see a lot of films. Cinema has always been a real touchstone for me as a writer, and I always know I've seen a really good film when I leave there wanting to write, I never look at books that have similar things going on to what I'm writing about, but I do look at films or music or paintings or photographs or poems that are similar in theme. But I don't look at other novels because I don't want it to seep over anyway, Last question? Yes.
Okay, these playlists. I have noticed the music, because I'm a music person. Occasionally you throw me a curve, and I have to look up one.
Good.
The playlists for the other novels, are they up there like this one?
They're all on Spotify. If you just go to Spotify and type in the book title, they should come up. The only one that's on YouTube is Lark Ascending. My students have taught me recently that it's much more egalitarian to put soundtracks on YouTube than on anything you have to subscribe to. So I've learned that. So I'll slowly get them all on YouTube. If anybody else has a question you didn't get to answer, I'd be glad to answer it over here at this table. I'll be right over here. So thank y'all so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. We have refreshments in the back. There are books for sale. Silas will be signing them at the middle table. A last reminder that next Thursday at 7:30, Crystal Wilkinson will be here. So we hope that we can see you again. And have a good evening.